The Legend of Heroes: Trails of Cold Steel 4: The End of Saga finally hit Western shores in the fall of 2020. It brought closure, tying together the stories of 3 sub-series spanning 8 games released across 16 years. Calling developer Nihon Falcom ambitious would be apropos. That same ambition has now taken the series to Nintendo Switch, first with Trails of Cold Steel 3, and now with the grand finale. Of course, this video is spoiler-free for Cold Steel 4, but End of Saga is the culmination of several storylines. Therefore, the game itself will contain significant spoilers for all its preceding entries. If you'd like to avoid those spoilers, this is your chance to click away. Further, much like my review of Cold Steel 3's port for Switch, this video will not be wholly independent. I'll be examining the technical and performance aspects of Cold Steel 4 on Switch, and seeing how it lines up with both the PlayStation version and other RPGs on Nintendo's hybrid platform. Be sure to check out my original review for a more thorough look at End of Saga. And before we begin, please subscribe and click the bell to get updated whenever I post new content. You can also check out my other videos, especially my dedicated Falcom playlist. Okay then, if you're still here, then you know what lies ahead, so let's get started. This supplemental review is based on a physical retail copy of the game for the Nintendo Switch. Trails of Cold Steel 4 on Nintendo Switch follows very closely in the footsteps of its predecessor. Docked resolution sits at a native 720p, while handheld opts for a dynamic 720p. The game uses the same engine as Cold Steel 3, and as such, the graphics feature the same issues. End of Saga on Switch also lacks any visual post-processing, which makes everything look a lot muddier in motion. There's noticeable ghosting in places, and the graphics have artifacting and aliasing issues throughout. As is standard with the Nintendo Switch, undocked resolution looks a lot sharper thanks to the smaller display masking many of the underlying issues. The image isn't actually sharper, of course. In fact, it's even softer than the docked visuals. However, it's just easier to overlook many of the small visual errors on such a small screen. Since the graphics are on par with Cold Steel 3 on Switch, it ends up with the same conclusion. This Cold Steel 4 port has its visual issues, but it all looks fine at a glance. It's far from the worst looking RPG on Switch, but compared to the platform's other RPG offerings like Dragon Quest XI's, Monster Hunter Rise, and Persona 5 Strikers, I'd say Cold Steel 4 is sitting right at the median line. Again, if you've previously played Cold Steel 3 on Switch, you know what to expect. Obviously, Switch compared to PlayStation is a clear downgrade. Textures have been simplified, the draw distance has been reduced, and shadows and lighting are not as vibrant. Here's a split screen if you prefer that comparison style. And why don't we add a few linear wipes just for good measure, starting with undocked, then docked, finally on the PlayStation. Still, given the series' historical lack of graphical prowess, along with Falcom's history on the PlayStation Portable and PlayStation Vita, I don't expect the Switch version's visuals to be a deal breaker for any hardcore fans. Obviously, I bought the game myself, and I'm a fan of the series. If anything, I actually think the graphics look pretty good as far as the series goes, even considering the sacrifices made in transition to Nintendo's hybrid console. Of course, it doesn't look as nice as other platforms, but that's the case with pretty much all Switch ports. If you didn't play the PC or PlayStation versions of Cold Steel 3 or 4, or you're just willing to accept the downgrades in exchange for just having it on Nintendo Switch, I think you'll be fine. The frame rate is where this port's real issues lie. Cold Steel 3 also had framerate problems on Nintendo Switch, but in practice, it was easy enough to overlook, especially on the tablet. That's unfortunately not quite as true for Cold Steel 4 on Switch, though. This version of End of Saga targets 30 FPS in any form, but will only consistently hit that mark during non-action segments. Oftentimes, the combat gameplay will be sitting anywhere in the 20s, with the worst issues cropping up whenever there are a lot of effects on screen. In handheld mode, there were actually times when the game encountered micro-freezing during more demanding animations. Cold Steel 3 on Switch sparingly had this issue towards the latter portions of the game, but here in Cold Steel 4, it's peppered all throughout. What you're looking at right now is literally at the beginning of the game. And sadly, End of Saga's handheld problems are not as easy to overlook when compared to its predecessor. It's just very obvious that this version isn't hitting the benchmarks that it should. There are some saving graces here though, and they're the same as those from Cold Steel 3. It's a turn-based game, so snappy action isn't super important in the grand scheme of things, and turbo mode helps alleviate a significant amount of the frustration. While Turbo Mode is still merely a band-aid on a bullet wound, it is thankfully a mostly satisfactory bypass. Clicking the left analog stick to enable Turbo Mode makes the game immensely more playable all throughout. You'll still get noticeable lag and choppiness here and there, but it's significantly better than playing at normal speed. What Turbo Mode cannot help with, however, are the loading screens. Cold Steel 3 obviously had them too, but Cold Steel 4's loading breaks feel particularly egregious. None of the individual screens are exceptionally long, but the sheer volume of loading interims can feel overbearing. Trails of Cold Steel 4 has a tendency to play a fragment of a cutscene, then hit a loading screen, then play another segment, followed by another loading screen. And since the loading times on Switch are longer than on PlayStation, it really bogs down the pacing of this already over 100-hour-long RPG. Check out this cutscene set in Ortis, again from the beginning of Cold Steel 4, and compare the PlayStation version to the Nintendo Switch version. Once again, this is quite similar to what's seen at the end of Cold Steel 3 on Switch, only here in Cold Steel 4, it's found from the beginning on out. And that's not to mention the return of Cold Steel 3's intermittent crashing. I was lucky enough to avoid them in 3, but Cold Steel 4's crashes can occur from the outset, especially in tablet mode. Thankfully, I have a habit of saving my game constantly, so I never lost a lot of progress, but this is obviously something that all prospective players should know before diving in. Alright, I do feel like I'm kind of skewering this port here, but aside from the crashing, which is an uncommon but still very important issue, the rest of this is all minor stuff, and none of it should ruin the experience. If you've never played End of Saga on other platforms, it'll be much easier to overlook those things, and Cold Steel 4's performance here should generally be in line with Cold Steel 3 on Switch. And even if you have played 3 and or 4 on other platforms, if you understand that this game is just like other Switch ports that had to sacrifice some things in exchange for portability, you know exactly what's in store. For fairness' sake, there are a lot of Switch RPGs that look and run better than End of Saga, but there are a lot that look and run about even, and some that are actually worse. Caligula Effect Overdose, Landgrisser 1 and 2, even the recently released Bravely Default 2, I would argue, has parts that look and run about on par with Cold Steel 4. And Cold Steel 4 is honestly better than all of those. Again, Falcom games are not exactly known for groundbreaking visuals. They're known for being immense and intricate, and that remains true here. This may not be the definitive version, but the core experience of Cold Steel 4 remains one of the finest story-driven RPGs out there. So in my heart, I truly believe End of Saga is a wonderful game, one that's well worth playing on any platform. But there are a lot of asterisks that come with this statement in regards to the Nintendo Switch version. The resolution, the frame rate, the aliasing and artifacting, the visual ghosting, the intermittent crashes, the load times, it really is a shame that the Switch version isn't better optimized. I would have happily waited longer for at least the crashes to be ironed out. As it stands, there are a lot of issues. But for all its problems, Cold Steel 4 has as many strengths, and between the two Kiseki games ported to Nintendo's hybrid console, I think I'd still have to call it a draw. Cold Steel 3's Switch port also had a multitude of problems, though not as many as Cold Steel 4's Switch port. However, I think the actual content of 4 is better than the content of 3. The character arcs, the gameplay, the story conclusion, End of Saga is still the same fantastic game that it has always been at its core. And as far as the technical performance of Falcom's titles go, this is far from the worst there is. I'm really just happy that more people are getting a chance to experience the works of this stalwart RPG studio. Just be sure to save your game a bit more often. The Legend of Heroes Trails of Cold Steel 4 on Nintendo Switch earns an 8 out of 10. Once again, please subscribe and click the bell to stay up to date on all my content, and of course check out my other videos. I've done a fair bit of Falcom content, which is annotated on screen. Thanks!